In this section, we are going to cover data types. And this is going to be an incredibly important part because understanding data types is one of the most fundamental things you have to understand about programming. Python does have quite a few different data types. We have actually seen some already. The one that we have used the most is words, which is just a string. It really is just a fancy word that programmers use. We are just talking about words. Besides that, we have also used different kind of numbers. We have seen integers and we have seen floating point numbers. The only difference between the two is that floating point numbers has decimal points, whereas integers are always full numbers. The reason why that is quite technical and you don't have to worry about it. You can work with them very, very easily and they are basically interchangeable from your point of view. There are only very rare exceptions where that is not the case. And those exceptions you probably are not going to come across unless you get into some very specific topics. Besides that, there's one more data type that we have seen as well, and that is a boolean. And boolean data types can only ever have two values. They are either true or false. And in the context where we have seen them is some kind of math operation. For example, 10 is greater than 5 was true. These Boolean values you are going to work quite a lot later with to organize the flow of your code. For example, you might only want to run some code if a certain condition is true. Besides those four data types, Python has quite a few more. Some are more important, some are less important. But there are four that you absolutely have to know. And let's start with the easiest one, a list. This is basically just a container to store other data types. For example, in this list right now, we have three values. We have 1 and 2, and both of those are integers. And besides that, we have a string, which is just a word. You could also store Boolean or floating point numbers, and you could even store a list inside of another list. Python really is flexible here. Besides that, we have tuples, we have sets, and we have dictionaries. And all four of those data types are just there to store other values. The difference between them is that they're storing data slightly differently. A list and a tuple differ because a list can be changed, whereas a tuple cannot be changed. A set would be different because every value inside of it has to be unique. And there are a lot of ways to compare different sets to filter out data. And finally, a dictionary is a much more organized way to store your data. In here, we always have a name and then a data type. I am going to go through all of those in detail throughout this section. And then we are going to go in quite some detail into all of them. Besides those, there are also some data types that are much less common. I will cover those at the end of this section. They really aren't that important, but you do want to be aware of where they appear and why they matter. But generally, Python is incredibly relaxed about different data types. Most of the time, you are actually not even going to notice. For example, if you have an integer and a floating point number, for example, this could be 1 plus 1.2, and Python here would automatically convert these two numbers into a floating point number with 2.2. You have essentially combined different data types, but because Python is so flexible about it, you didn't even notice. Which is one of the main reasons why integers and floating point numbers, especially for beginners, are basically identical and you never have to worry about them. On top of that, Python also has a ton of functionality to change different data types. I'm going to cover that very soon as well.